Hello, the topic of my presentation is translation quality in international large-scale assessments in education. I want to make a presentation of myself. My name is Luela Liçi. I have graduated in a Master of Sciences in Translation and Interpretation from the University of Tirana, Albania. Currently, I am an assistant lecturer in the Department of English Language, Faculty of Foreign Languages, University of Tirana. My research interests are translation studies. First of all, I want you to present the content of my presentation. First, it will be the focus and the aim of the presentation, then a kind of introduction to international large-scale studies in education, then translation quality in PISA teams and peers, where are included, of course, the translation process, the adaptation and verification processes, advantages and challenges of translation quality, and references. Well, my presentation focuses on translation quality and its management as an important concern of PISA teams and peers. The aim is to present the findings on translation quality policy and procedures implemented by PISA teams and peers, and even the achievements and challenges of translation quality implemented by PISA teams and peers. But what are PISA teams and peers? They are international large-scale assessments in education. PISA stands for Program for International Student Assessment. It assesses reading, mathematics, science, problem solving, and global competences. The age of the test takers is 15 years old, and more or less they belong or they attend the 9th grade. It has been administered every 3 years since 2000. The purpose is to evaluate education systems by assessing to what extent students at the end of compulsory education can apply their knowledge to real-life situations and be equipped for society. It is skill-based, and usually the length of the test is 120 minutes plus 15 minutes background questionnaire, and it is organized by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. TEAMS stand for Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study. So it assesses mathematics and science. The age group of the test takers is 10 and 14 years old. They belong or they attend the 4th and the 8th grade. It is administered every 4 years since 1995. It measures trends in math, science achievements, describe educational context including home support, students' attitudes, curriculum, teachers' training, classroom activities. It is curriculum based. The test length is about 72 minutes regarding the 4th grade, 90 minutes regarding the 8th grades, plus 15 minutes background for the background questionnaire. It is organized by the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement. PEERS stands for Progress in International Reading Literacy Study. It assesses reading literacy. The age of the test taker takers is 10 years old, and they attend the 4th grade. It is administered, or it has been administered every 5 years since 2001. It measures trends in reading comprehension, investigates the experiences young children have at home and in school in learning to read. It is also curriculum based, and it is also organized by the International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement. Now, Before I start with the translation quality, I want to mention the fact that all these large-scale assessments, international ones, need to be translated in the various languages of the participating countries. And as a result, the translation quality is really important. So I will focus on the aims, principles, standards, and procedures concerning the translation quality. Now, the demand on the high quality of translation and rigorous test translation review procedures is dictated by the administration of the assessment instruments in different education systems worldwide. The translation of the assessment instrument into different language versions, the requirement to ensure valid testing among countries, the requirement to ensure comparability of the assessment data among countries, the requirement to ensure equivalency of assessment instruments in meaning and difficulty, the requirement of the equally easy to read and understand the text of the assessment instruments, the requirement to keep the student mental effort the same everywhere, to ensure that no more working memory is needed by the student to decode and understand the material, and the requirement to avoid heavier cognition student load. When a test is translated and adapted from one language to another, test developers and/or test users are responsible for describing the methods used in establishing the adequacy of the adaptation and documenting empirical or logical evidence of the validity of test score interpretations for intended use. The challenge of properly translating and adapting assessment instruments across different languages involves providing equivalent, culturally appropriate, and fair instruments with meaningful, interpretive, and valid outcomes. Guidelines to evaluate the quality of national translations. So the translated texts should have the same register, so language level and degree of formality, as the source text. If using the same register could be perceived as inappropriate in the target culture, then the register needs to be adapted and this needs to be documented. The translated text should have correct grammar and usage. Example, subject-verb agreement, prepositions, or verb tenses. The translated text should not clarify or remove text from the source text and should not add more information. The translated text should use equivalent social, political, and historical terminology appropriate in the target language. The translated text should have equivalent qualifiers and modifiers appropriate for the target language. Idiomatic expressions should be translated appropriately, not necessarily word for word. And spelling, punctuation, and capitalization in the target text should be appropriate for the target language and the country's national context. Now, throughout the translation and adaptation process, the overreaching purpose is to create a set of instruments that is comparable to the original in terms of reading difficulty and accessibility, while still allowing each country to adapt the materials to their national needs. Process of international verification of the national translations and adaptations was intended to make certain that the translated materials were equivalent to the international versions through direct comparisons of the two. So let's take them one by one. What is meant by translation, what is meant by adaptation, and verification. Translation is concerned with the transformation of a text from one language to another. Text translation is linguistically driven, content over intent. When speaking about translation, the focus is on the linguistic transformation of a text. We transform test items formulated in one language into test items formulated in another language. An adaptation is an intentional deviation from the source version or versions made for cultural reasons or to conform to local usage. Adaptation takes responsibility for offering proof of the fact that the target language form is close enough or equivalent, as we will see, to the source language form, not only in language but in its intended use and consequences. Items are modified or adapted to suit the target cultural context. Test adaptation is validity driven. In test adaptation, staying true to the intent of the original text is more important than capturing the actual original content. Cultural references from the source culture are modified to suit the target culture. And verification means checking a metric against specification and confirmation that the specifications have been fulfilled. During the translation process, there are various ways that this can be done in these large-scale assessments. First, one of the options might be back translation. In this approach, the test is first translated into the target language and then back into the source language. After this, the two source language texts are compared to each other, and the quality of the target text is judged on the basis of how comparable the two source language texts are. Then the second option is double translation. So this approach requires that two translators should first independently translate the source material into the target language. Then a third person should reconcile these two translations into a single national version. Let's see what option have Teams, Pearls, and PISA opted for. Teams and Pearls opted for back translation. So one translator proceeds one target version on the basis of one source version. Typically, it is in English language. The target version is reviewed by a reviewer. Whereas PISA, on the other hand, has opted for double translation, so in most of its versions. Two translators produce two independent target versions, either both from English or one from English and the other from French. The two target versions are merged into one national version by a translator called reconciler, who also checks that the resulting version is correct and natural. The reviewed or reconciled version has then been verified by an international verifier. Let's see the translation quality according PISA. It is of core importance that the translation process does not introduce biases that distort international comparison by simplifying or making more difficult the comprehensions of text, graphics, or tables used as stimulus in the various test units. Unintentionally modifying the difficulty of the questions asked to the student through a formulation that changes the type of mental strategy required or the intent construct. Introducing ambiguities that could impair some of the variables collected through the background questionnaires because of the lack of comparability across countries, or adapting manuals to the national context in a way that extensively changed the data collected. Example, when adaptation result in undesired changes in the sampling, test administration, or coding procedures. So let's see how the adaptation process is carried out by PISA and Teams and Pearls, since Teams and Pearls use more or less the same adaptation process. So according to PISA, the general principle will be to restrict national adaptations to those cases where they are required, so as to avoid needlessly confronting students with expressions or concepts that are much less familiar to them than to students in other countries, but without affecting the very substance of the text or the items. Usually the things that are adapted are mathematical symbols, abbreviations and formulas, names of persons and locations can usually be adapted. It is usually never adapted the format of an item. Even there are not included explanatory notes or additional instructions. The Z currency is not adapted to the local currency, and as well as the question layout is not adapted. Some names should not be adapted, and usually these names, there are some specific guidelines regarding the translator, and that specific names should not be adapted. Usually those names are the names of the characters, places, biographical names, names of institutions or agencies. And the adaptator or the verifier is invited to think of possible other adaptation that may be needed in his or her country. And there are even some instances or let's say adaptations of test questionnaires and manuals. They are not fully adapted, but some parts of them still need to be adapted. According to teams and peers, when adapting and translating expressions with more contextually appropriate terms, translators must ensure that the meaning and difficulty of the item remains the same as the international version. Also, translators must ensure the consistency of adaptations and translation from item to item. Although the National Center or the national reconcilers are strongly encouraged to keep adaptations to a minimum, some adaptations are necessary in order to prevent students from facing unfamiliar context or vocabulary that could hinder their ability to read and understand the item. In some classes, changes to the instruments may be necessary to follow national conventions of measurement, mathematical notation. For example, the decimal separators, multiplication sign, punctuation, and expressions of date and time. Some terms in the text are not to be changed or adapted beyond translation. So examples include proper name of actual people and places, as well as the fictional currency Z. Well, of course, during the process of translation, adaptation, and verification, there is a kind of linguistic quality control that is run by the organizations. Well, what is this? So the linguistic quality control, it is used to check whether translated or adapted data collection instruments comply with the translation and adaptation notes. It is also used to report issues as well as risks, to propose or implement and follow up corrective actions. So during the linguistic quality control, it is performed a verification by linguists, or sometimes even by peers, so linguist plus domain specialist. Then there is a documentation of issues, so if the verifier finds it reasonable to make a certain change in the translated document or material, then he or she needs to use some intervention categories to document his or her change. Then monitoring of corrective action, which is the final check, and quantitative and qualitative reports. Okay, so these are more or less the PISA translation verification system and Teams and Peers translation verification systems. So more or less they have the same, let's say, they follow the same steps, besides some small differences concerning the intervention categories and the way how Teams and Peers measure or name the intervention categories. Well, which are the achievements in translation quality? Translation quality is a vital part of PISA Teams and Peers. PISA Teams and Peers have developed a translation quality policy. They have developed translation, adaptation, and verification procedures and have established structures responsible for the translation quality implementation. Translation quality is a structured and documented activity. Unified translation, adaptation, and verification procedures within each program, PISA, Teams, and Peers are implemented the translation, adaptation, and verification process of PISA teams and peers are fully documented. PISA teams and peers have contributed to develop theory and practice of translation quality in the field of education material translations. They have also contributed in the capacity building through creating pools of translators, verifiers, test administrators, school coordinators, through training translators, verifiers, national project managers, through transferring translation quality procedures to national assessment. Challenges in translation quality. Well, there are many challenges, and some of them are the cooperation among all actors involved in the translation quality procedure. Since there are many steps to be followed, each step has a person in charge of the step, and usually the cooperation among all the actors may become a little bit difficult. Then even the quality of translators is really important, and sometimes forms a challenge. Special training of translators and verifiers on error metric methodology, digitalization of the translation quality process. And these are the references for my presentation. Thank you for your attention.